this cataclysm that occurred and brought to ruin the old world. It absolutely and utterly destroyed the old world. And this was known. The Egyptians kept records, extensive records of this. The Greeks, the Romans, all of these different cultures around the world, certainly the Persians and all of the Mesopotamian cultures had these flood mythos, these cataclysm mythologies, which in the Middle East always, almost in every case, the Mesopotamian lore involved a global deluge.
Right.
So I happen to believe that the root of all of these stories, the origin of these stories, is the original story, which was disseminated by Noah and his offspring after the aqueous cataclysm that destroyed at least the part of the earth that he was living in. And so it makes sense that all of these variegated mythologies would have a singular source, an origin story that they all shared. And some would contend, no, the origin story would have to be the Mesopotamian account with Utnapishtim, who's their Noah figure, and that whole account, because in terms of the literature, it predates the Bible. But that's assuming that the story predates the Hebrew account, which there's no reason to believe that whatsoever. If in fact, all of these flood mythologies around the world originated from the account that was disseminated by Noah and his offspring, then that oral tradition is the root of all other traditions.
So that is the oldest.
That would be the oldest, because they're the ones who came through the deluge.
Right. And then the biblical account or understanding is that Noah and his family reproduced after the flood. People began to multiply. And then there was the Tower of Babel event. Yes, everybody was one group until that point, right?
Yes, the origin of Mesopotamian culture, the origin of the Sumerians and the Akkadians would be Noah and his sons.
Right.
That would be the origin of that culture.
Yeah.
It's not the other way around. It wouldn't be that the Mesopotamian culture is the origin of the Hebrew culture, which, by the way, that is a true statement. But what I mean is, so let me rephrase that. The Mesopotamian culture is, in fact, the origin of the Hebrew culture, but it's not the origin of the Hebrew traditions. The Hebrew traditions would go back to Noah and the other pre-flood patriarchs. So that's an important distinction, because people are always going to say, wait a minute, doesn't the Sumerian account, for example, predate the biblical account? Well, it doesn't matter which piece of literature is older. What matters is, what is the origin story?
Right.
If the origin story is in fact Noah and his sons, then that is the original story from which the Mesopotamian accounts, from which the Sumerians and the Akkadians and the Babylonians and the Egyptians are derived, from which their accounts are derived.
Yeah. That's a really, really good point, Tim, because one of the arguments against Christianity is we have just copied earlier religions, earlier texts, the cuneiform tablets, the Sumerian, the Anunnaki, all of those things. They just say that we have copied and changed and adapted what was older. But it sounds like you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, that actually the biblical account is the one that's the real narrative, because it's the one that comes from Noah and his descendants who actually lived the events. And everybody else, like the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Canaanites, the Babylonians, all of them weren't necessarily the ones keeping the true account. They might have been influenced by other forces.
Exactly right. They would have had a modified version. And in my view, the Hebrews, because remember, as I said before, this is an important distinction. We know that Hebrew culture came out of Mesopotamia because Abraham, who's the father of the Israelites, came out of Mesopotamia. So that was the Sumerian or Akkadian, depending on where the land of Ur was located. It could have been in either. But regardless, both of those are offshoots of a base Proto-Mesopotamian culture, right? Proto-Sumerian, let's say. So that Proto-Sumerian culture would have been Noah and his sons, which we might then say that Proto-Sumerian culture was, in fact, the original antediluvian culture.
Right.
So it would make sense that everyone would speak the same language because Noah and his sons weren't speaking different languages. They were communicating with one language.
Right.
That would have been the lingua franca from before the flood. And then as the populations grew, then you would have differentiation in the cultures that sprung out of the offspring of Noah.
Right.
And this is indeed what the biblical narrative describes. And so you would have all of these different cultures that are separating from one another and going and spreading out and going all over the earth, are carrying with them seeds of the original stories.
Mm.
And then those stories are becoming modified. There are cultural alterations happening. So that's why you would have so many stories that have many of the same features to them, but are variegated in regard to detail.
Right.
The names change, the number of people who survived the flood changes, the methodology by which they survived the flood changes, the gods who are involved in the story change.
They adapt it. They adapt it to their culture and to their needs, right?
Right, and because they're all carrying the seeds, they're all carrying the seeds of this story.
Right.
But the languages are different now, and they're becoming, there's distance now between it's the game of telephone, really. It's the original oral tradition is, as time goes on, is being altered in each culture, and it's idiocentric to each culture. So you're going to have a cultural, you're going to have a different cultural flavor for each story because of that. So it only makes sense. It only makes sense that all of these different civilizations around the world are remembering the same event slightly differently.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's an origin story. Now, you can choose to believe that origin story is the Sumerian account, or you can choose to believe that it's the biblical account, that it's the Noahic, that it's the, let's call it the account we have in the Old Testament, potentially written down by Moses, or you can believe that there's some other origin. But what you cannot deny is the universality of the cataclysm mythos.
Mm.
There was a cataclysm. There's no question about it. There was a cataclysm. And again, because I adhere to the biblical narrative, subscribe to the biblical narrative, I believe that the origin of the story is indeed Noah, who came through the cataclysm and was preserving the oral traditions, probably also the particular certain manuscripts. He might even have had with him the Book of Enoch. It would have looked different than the one we have today, with some similarities, especially in the in the first two sections, the Book of the Watchers and the Book of Parables, which are the oldest. But Noah very well could have carried these important documents through the flood, as well as the oral tradition, and from that origin, you get all of the mythos all over the world.